famous British comedy troupe, and now for something completely different. It is my pleasure today to welcome to you to this panel on reputational security in an era of geopolitical rivalry. This panel will explore the premise that a good global reputation is essential to the defense of a state's national security and economic interests. This panel is inspired in part by the work of Nicholas Cull on reputational security, Nicholas Cull, of course, being one of our panelists today. His work links national image and national image promotion to state survival, particularly in this complex information environment in which we find ourselves. Today's distinguished panelists have been asked to address three related questions to reputational security. The first, what are the challenges to the projection of national soft power and legitimacy in an era of intensifying great power competition? The second, what can nations do to build or reclaim credibility in the global information space? And finally, what can nations do to mitigate adversarial attempts to undermine national reputation and alliances? As I said, we have a very distinguished set of panelists. Joining us online, there he is, hello Nick, is Professor Nick Cull, Professor of Public Diplomacy and founding director of the Master's Program in Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California. He will be followed by Volodymir Sheiko, the director of the Ukrainian Institute. We will then hear from Olena Snigyr, who is the Jean Monnet Fellow at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. She will be followed by Maya Mikashavidze, who is a professor of media communication at the Georgian Institute of Public Affairs. And finally, to round us out, we have James Pament, who is associate professor of strategic communication and director of the Lund University Psychological Defense Research Institute. So I have a set of questions for our panelists to address. And then, of course, we hope to have your questions to explore this relatively new concept of reputational security. So, Nick, I'm going to start with you as essentially the originator of this concept. Why does reputation matter? And particularly thinking of the case of Ukraine in 2014 and then Ukraine in 2022. Nick, over to you all the way from California.
Clear for this part. So just hold on a moment, Vivian. And thank you very much for having me. I am very sorry that I'm not with you in person. Sorry, it's
purpose
half
always.
Past 3 in, it's 3:30 in the morning, so I'm doing my best. This all relates to material that's in my new book, Reputational Security, which is now available on both sides of the Atlantic. So I want to address how I define reputational security, apply the concept to Ukraine, and talk a little bit about key strategies, and address this issue that I think essentially that we have to relocate reputation. And part of the problem, as I see it, is that because of the strength and the success of the post-Cold War concept of soft power, this had come to be the dominant framework for thinking about reputation, that it had become something that only where the dominant frame of thinking about it was applied only to the most successful countries. And so it was seen as something that a really successful country could enhance rather than something that was essential to a vulnerable place. So the essential concept is to reframe soft power, to shift the debate into the space of security, and to think rather than going over and over the most impressive things that the most successful countries do, rather to think about negatives and vulnerabilities and to think, well, where are reputations weakest? Where are they being damaged? And my central point is that in a time of crisis, the condition of your reputation can become critical, and that a positive reputation helps in a time of crisis, and conversely, the absence of a positive reputation can become critical and can lead to really nasty things happening to a country. That a negative reputation hurts. And this diagram sums it up. So I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but the idea here is that we have a threshold for external aid for the international community to help a place in a time of crisis. And this could be a natural disaster. It could also be when threatened by a neighbor. A country that lacks reputational security will not be helped. A country with reputational security makes it over the line and is supported by the world. And so if absent, reputation is a quality that needs to be developed. And what really put me on to the concept in the first place was in 2014, when the Ukraine crisis moved into that new level with the taking of Crimea and so forth. Other countries where I was working, I'm thinking here about, I was in Kazakhstan, I was in Kosovo and elsewhere in that region. They explained what had happened in terms of a lack on the part of Ukraine, that the story of Ukraine wasn't well enough known. It didn't have a reputation, so that when something bad happened, the international community was not appalled. In fact, you could see how when the crisis hit Ukraine, the Western world hadn't even decided on the name of the country. They were still using the Soviet era formulations, Soviet era Russian language spelling of place names. And this was just a symptom of the way in which the Soviet era narrative, that this was just one more part of Russia with a slightly different history, nothing distinct, dominated or at least confused the way that the country was perceived. I think Ukraine itself could see that this was a problem, that it hadn't done a good job of establishing its post-Soviet identity. And so new institutions like the Ukraine Foundation were established with an agenda to tell Ukraine's story to the world, and specifically to the Western world, to the NATO countries. We also saw a really interesting phenomenon of a kind of reputational diplomacy, where misrepresentations of Ukraine were corrected. The one that I noticed particularly is in the autumn of 2021, when the representation of a Ukrainian character in the Netflix show Emily in Paris was addressed by the foreign ministry. And okay, they had a lot of things to think about in the autumn of 2021, but to also be taking on board how Netflix was representing young Ukrainians living in Paris, I think shows how seriously it was being taken. In fact, Dmitry Kuleba said, the foreign minister said, reputation of Ukraine is a matter of national security. So he made no apology for caring about and seeking to advance the reputation of the country. I think that, as what happened to Ukraine in 2014 shows what happens when you lack a reputation, so the support we see that was possible for Ukraine in 2022 shows how it can the outcomes can be better or enhanced if you've been working on your reputation. And so I would say that by 2022, Ukraine had achieved a level of reputational security where what people thought about the country in the West was much enhanced, and so there was tremendous pressure for aid. I think it's even more striking how consumer pressure compelled companies to withdraw from Russia. 1,000 companies withdrew from Russia following the Russian invasion in February of 2022. Of course, it hasn't all gone Ukraine's way reputationally, and I'm struck by the way in which Russia retains reputational security in the global south. So I spend a lot of time in South Africa, and there people quite openly say they supported us in our fight against imperialism. We still have a feeling and that comes from that point. So reputation, sometimes the reputation of others causes one difficulties. So this is to adapt that chart I showed you earlier on. This would be a reconfiguring to show Ukraine's position. The threshold for aid, I think, dropped between 2014 and 2022 because of a rising awareness in the danger represented by the Russian state. But I think there's lots of evidence, including my numbers here come from perceptions of Ukraine in a corruption index, to show how the international view, international community's view of the country was greatly improved. So I would argue then that once you've achieved a reputation, it's then something that has to be defended. We can look at the world and see how enemies attack reputations. Reputation is a major target for disinformation, with narratives that are disruptive to reputations regularly figuring in disinformation. I think when we come to counter strategies, and this was part of what you were asking at the beginning, that the best counter strategy is not just positive messaging, not just saying what you're saying is not true. It's also listening to the vulnerabilities exposed in attacks and seeking to ensure that the realities are as positive as they can be. And here I go back to a famous American song by Johnny Mercer, Accentuate the Positive, which was cited as a strategy by an American public diplomat in the 1960s. And the song goes, you have to accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative. And I think that these two go closely together. So we shouldn't just talk about the importance of accentuating positives by telling the world how good we are. We also need to eliminate the negatives and take off the table the realities that detract from our reputation. And this is the importance of international standards of human rights, of the fight against corruption, and ensuring that we are the best we can be for reputational purposes. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to continuing the discussion as we move on.
Thank you so much, Nick. I was particularly struck by your phrase talking about Ukraine in 2014, that the story wasn't well enough known. Ukraine's story wasn't well enough known. And that, of course, I think echoes a marvelous statement that the Prime Minister made this morning about the importance of story, the importance of having a narrative that is credible to audiences.
Yes.
So now I think this is the perfect moment to hear from someone who is living inside the story, and who is not only living inside the current story of Ukraine, but in his capacity as director of the Ukrainian Institute is in charge of, if you will, shaping that story or narrative. So, Volodymyr, my question for you is, how can seemingly intangible assets like cultural assets and cultural relations actually contribute to national security?
Thank you, Vivian. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm really happy that this theme, this topic, has made it to the conference agenda, a conference that is centered around the concept of security. And in my professional work, in my professional life, I often hear from various experts on security that there is no place for culture, there is no place for soft power in discussions and debates about security. They even coined a term, securitization of issues that are seemingly unrelated to security as a hard power, as a hard tool that we're so used to. So it's good that we are blending in these two paradigms and discussing soft power assets, intangible assets, and indeed reputation as an important security factor for individual countries, but also the world at large. And I'm really thankful to Nick for coining this term reputational security and exploring it in his in plenty of Nick's works. It's very indeed productive and useful and helpful to describe what Ukraine is going through, but I believe that it's also applicable to so many other conflicts that are going on in the world today. But also I think it can be quite easily and flexibly backdated to other wars and conflicts that took place around the world over the past decades, but even earlier than that as well. The trouble with reputational security and the trouble with reputation as opposed to hard power assets such as military might or economic advantages a country may have is that these assets do not exist in material reality. So reputation does not exist as a given. It exists only in the minds of people. It only exists in the minds of the recipients of certain messages, of certain owners of certain knowledge, and they can only be measured largely through subjective categories, through subjective ways of measuring this concept. It can change very quickly. Reputation, much like perceptions, much like attitudes, can be changed fairly quickly. We are working with limited attention spans of people when we are trying to manage or shape a reputation or even an image of an individual or indeed a country at large. Reputation, I argue, is quite difficult to build. It takes a long time and a concerted, sustained effort to shape a reputation, and it unfortunately can be quite easily manipulated by disinformation, by other actions adversaries may employ to undermine other countries' credibility or reputation. And I'm also glad that we, and Nick particularly touched upon this concept of vulnerabilities as opposed to strengths. We've talked today a lot about strengths in international relations, particularly military strengths or diplomatic might and prowess, but I think it's worth also, when speaking about reputational security, to talk about what vulnerabilities can it address and what gaps in those vulnerabilities can it breach. And among those vulnerable spots, you know, we can name weapons that targets these spots. If reputation is a shield, then what? It's a weapon. Weapons may include, obviously, disinformation as a major obstacle to a country's achieving their reputational security, cyber warfare, and indeed public and cultural diplomacy that, to various degrees of success, a lot of countries have been employing to defend their cause, to shape their narratives, to project their national image and national reputation internationally. How do cultural assets and how do intangible assets contribute to national security today? I think they give a country or a society or a community an agency. they enable their own voices on behalf of countries or societies. They attach a very distinct and convincing identity to a society or to a place. And that transforms, I think, how a country can behave and is perceived in international relations if it has enough credibility, if it has enough agency, if it has enough cultural background that is known to everyone else. It's much easier to have a conversation as equals. It's much easier to project a narrative. And it's much easier to make that narrative stay with the recipient. That's the biggest challenge in communication, that's basic theory of communication. It's not enough just to send a message. The main goal, the ultimate goal of communications is to have that message stay with the recipient and change somehow their behavior, attitudes, or actions. And that's the ultimate goal of communications. That is also the hardest one to achieve. And just to conclude this, I think my first kind of round of remarks, I think we should look at Ukraine as probably as an exemplary case of you know, lacking international reputational security and then sort of quickly regaining or gaining it, particularly in the outbreak of the full-scale invasion. But I think we should also remember other conflicts and wars, particularly in this region and neighboring regions that occurred over the past 30 years and so. So the war in Georgia in the early 90s, the war in Transnistria, also early 90s, the two Chechen wars, the wars in the Balkans after the breakup of Yugoslavia. Those are actually also exemplary cases of countries, territories, and peoples painfully lacking reputational security to twist the response of the international community to those wars. Just on the plane here, I read a fantastic book by a Bosnian writer, Ozren Kebo, which is called Sarajevo for Beginners. And that's his first-hand recollection of his experience of living through the siege of Sarajevo, through the 4-year siege of Sarajevo in the early to mid-90s. And it struck me as if this book was written in today's Ukraine. He was describing similar experience of helplessness, of lukewarm and lackluster response from the international community to that conflict. And he argues that no one or hardly anyone in the world knew what was exactly happening in the Western Balkans in the early 90s because that region was unknown. It lacked reputation, it lacked outward projection of itself, it lacked clear identity, or rather multiplicity of identities in the world, and that's why he thought that the country has suffered so much. And it could have been a very different story if that reputation was in place. So I think that's a very universal concept that we're discussing here that is indeed applicable to so many other contexts.
Thank you so much, Volodymyr, for highlighting the sort of universal and human component of this issue. I was going back to what you said about the importance of agency and the relationship between agency and credibility. A part of creating credibility, of projecting credibility, is creating a compelling narrative. And so I'd like to turn to Olena to ask the following question: how are national reputations built, especially in a period of competing and sometimes quite divisive or fractious narratives?
Yeah, thank you, Vivian, and it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for invitation. This is indeed a very hot topic, I would say. So I would start that today, it was already said today that the world has changed. And today's world, all countries are building their reputation now in conditions of chaotization, militarization, and I would say ideologicalization of international relations. So first, international law and international institutions could neither prevent war nor stop war crimes. The war has returned as to international politics as an appropriate instrument of foreign policy, and countries globally recognize that military capabilities, including nuclear weapons, are better security instruments than international law and norms. What is more important, ideology is back. Russia is painting the competition of great powers with ideological markers. It has brought historical resentment and conflict of values back into international politics. And it is supported by China and other authoritarian powers in it. The competition of great powers today takes on the features of a competition between authoritarianism and democracy is losing, unfortunately. So there is a soft power of liberal values, but, however, liberal values also are attractive to many and have their own soft power. Does reputation depend on adherence to values? I assume reputation can work equally in both cases. How can nations reclaim and build their reputation? So I would say that credibility or reliability is indeed pivotal for reputation. In the practical field, successful building or reclaiming credibility or image or reputation in the global informational space depends on, as Volodymir said already, agency, consistency, vision of goals, understanding of the target audience, and activity. So these are very, very practical instruments. But so credibility is ensured by confidence in behavior and consistency in actions, which creates trust. And here is nothing about values. So if Ukraine and Georgia believe, for example, that they will be safer within NATO, then they should prove their reliability to NATO countries, also in domestic policy, not in foreign policy declarations. Hypocrisy or inconsistency damages credibility so much that it cannot be fixed by any powerful cultural policy or cultural diplomacy. Today, we see a sharp change in attitudes towards Ukraine's membership in NATO, even in spite of the Russian war against Ukraine. It became possible due to the resoluteness and consistency that Ukraine showed in resilience to Russian aggression. But if we are talking about global credibility, then a country needs actually to prove its reliability in upholding the norms and principles that are important to the majority of the countries in the world. And what these norms and principles will be depends on what the dominant global discourse will be. And this is exactly what China and Russia are fighting for today, trying to prove the bankruptcy of the liberal ideas and attract as many countries as possible to the side of authoritarianism. So what can nations do to mitigate adversarial attempts to undermine national reputation and alliances? It is possible and necessary to push back harmful informational influence, and I will start from practical steps. It's debunking lies and manipulations, creation of legal and instrument restrictions to the dissemination of enemy propaganda, create and promote alternative, more relevant narrative to neutralize fake ones. However, really effective countermeasures are in the sphere of narratives, because all propaganda is designed within the framework of certain narratives that shape the worldview starting from school education. Russia is not trying to prove that it is doing right within the framework of current international legal norms. Russia is trying to convince others that this international order is wrong, and liberal values are harmful. Putin directly denies the legitimacy of international law and introduces the concept of historical justice into the political debate. Thus, historical narratives replace international legal arguments in political discussions. The success of Russian propaganda that appeals to historical narratives is explained by the fact that Russian imperial knowledge that has been created during 18th and 19th century actually became international knowledge. In fact, the West has become accustomed to looking at Russia and neighbors around Russia and dependent peoples of Russian Federation through Russian glasses. So reputation is not, lack of reputation is not always fault of a certain country, it is also a lack of critical approach of international academic community to its own knowledge. If we talk about Ukraine and Georgia, it was so difficult for us to convince our Western allies of real intentions of Russia for all these years. And Ukraine additionally had to prove that Ukrainians and Russians are not the one people. Thus, and this is about the very famous Russian narrative of denial of sovereignty and identity, which is applied by Russia to any potential victim of Russian aggressor. Thus, to mitigate adversarial attempts to undermine national reputations, it is necessary to identify narratives and the reasons for which these narratives take root, as well as how reputation is reproducing itself through the knowledge-making, academia, and education. Rather than fighting millions of fake narratives about Ukrainian Nazis, it is necessary to find a way to destroy a Rothan mythology of the Second World War. And rather than proving the right of Ukrainians or Baltic countries, for example, to have their own identity and their own state, it is necessary to destroy the colonial Russian optics through which the world looks at Ukraine and other neighbors of Russia. So here I would say that, to conclude, I would say that the West in general is also vulnerable to this because of this cognitive bias, because it is an obstacle to understand, to have a clear vision of the enemy's intentions and to make a clear analysis and prognosis. But it can be changed. And I would also mention that probably for future discussion that reputation also gives impunity for war crimes too.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your reminder of this cognitive bias that we all inevitably hold, but also drawing attention to viewing this through a glass darkly or through the Russian lens. But I want to turn back to the point that you made earlier about the importance of reliability and consistency in the narrative, in the story that a country tells about itself. And to explore that question from the Georgian angle, I would like to ask Maya if she could tell us a little bit about Georgia's place in the global imagination and the consequences for its own reputational security.
Well, thank you very much. It's such an honor and pleasure to participate in the panel and in the conference, listening to distinguished scholars and experts, politicians. My interest as a media scholar is primarily in the link between reputational security and global imagination. I find global imagination a very useful concept and a metaphor to illustrate how the world and people across the world construct, perceive various countries around the world, And there exists, obviously, the construct of Georgia in that imagination, in that global imagination, and of Ukraine, of course, comprised of random bits of pieces of information in people's heads. We all strive to shape that image, and for obvious reasons, as Dr. Cull said earlier, reputation matters, and it is directly linked to the security. People act upon those images of the countries, and they will be willing or unwilling to support giving critical resources to those countries, accepting those countries into alliances and unions, trading with countries, and even protecting and defending the countries. So in that sense, reputational security is especially important and even essential for small countries to achieve. Georgia and Ukraine have always recognized that reality, and if we go back into the recent history of post-independence Georgia and of Ukraine, we see how governments tried to reach out and project the image, credibility, but their biggest problem was Russia at the borders, which had more than 3 centuries of unimpeded possibility to shape the image of its neighbors, of smaller nations at its border, the way it saw fit. We were portrayed as unruly, uneducated, not having our own distinct identity, impossible to govern, and hugely dependent on Russia, corrupt, and the list goes endlessly. And what can we do when we are going against such a history of distortion of our images? Yes, there are possibilities, but like Olena said, and other speakers ahead of us, countries need to distribute and send very distinct messages about who they are and what they want. Governments, our government included, runs national communication strategies. We hold trade fairs, investment, tourist fairs, book fairs, advertising campaigns, and other types of strategic communication outputs. But we see our place and our shape in that identity, and now I can only speak of Georgia, to my view, is a bit fuzzy, because that very clear voice and messaging about what country wants and where it's heading is, in my view, missing. But fortunately, governments are not the only generators of the output. We have civil society, we have independent civil society, we have independent media, independent artists, all engaging with foreign audiences and all trying to project the image of Georgia. And I would disagree. Disagree, obviously, with some parts of some members in the government and some of my colleagues that, this more of a coordinated messaging is important, because as many governments in Georgia recognized from the first days of its independence, if the country's image is that of plural society, if there are voices of dissent coming from the country, independent voices, that is not detrimental in no way to the country's image. On the contrary, in Georgia's case, independent journalists, experts, scholars, think tanks, all were able to project the image of freedom, forward-looking country that is on its way to democratic reforms. And to circle back to global security and reputational security as it's one of its elements, it is important to say that it's not all about messaging, obviously, and not about image. The reputational security is as much about imagery as it is about reality. So in my view, Georgia should be doing better policies, stronger policy harmonization as well as harmonization of its communication to fit its Euro-Atlantic aspirations. And that would be the way forward, both work on the ground as well as its interpretation and in presentation in the global discourse.
Thank you so much, Maya. I particularly appreciated your notice of the importance of dissent. That disagreement, as long as it's a disagreement managed through discourse and debate, is a sign of democracy, a sign of strength, and a sign of resilience. And so I think in managing reputational security, as you pointed out, it's not to say that there are no challenges or issues, but it's creating the space to have a conversation about these differences and issues. But turning to James, I actually want to circle back to a comment that Volodymir made in his presentation. He said that reputation exists really only in the human mind. So James, from your perspective, how is psychological defense used as a method of building reputational security when it's all in your mind?
Great. Thank you for that question, Vivian. It's a pleasure to be here. Psychological defense is a doctrine of civilian defense that was created in Sweden and spread throughout the Nordics in the early 1950s. And its premise was that if the great powers surrounding you are conducting information warfare against civilians, your civilians need a psychological defense. So it's a defense against psychological warfare. During the Cold War, it took off. It became a huge public agency with over 600 people working for it in Sweden. And then at the end of the Cold War, obviously it wasn't needed anymore and was shut down. What we've seen since Ukraine, since Crimea, is the recreation of this psychological defense agency in Sweden. And similar movements in some small Nordic countries. And I think the main difference, the main reason why you might find this interesting is that a lot of the conversation so far has been on intangibles, the intangibles around reputation. But psychological defense is actually about capabilities. Which capabilities should a government be focusing upon in order to build a psychological defense that can handle propaganda, reputational attacks, and the other kinds of attacks that we've grown familiar with in the current geopolitical environment. So I'm going to talk about 4 groups of capabilities that psychological defense consists of, in my interpretation of it, I should add. The first is societal resilience. Now, traditionally, resilience refers to bounce-back ability, or how quickly you can recover from a setback. In its more modern interpretation, it's more about the ability to resist foreign influence, whether that influence comes from information attacks, propaganda, from cyber attacks, from hybrid attacks, from espionage, but your ability to resist those kind of attacks. And it builds upon vulnerability assessments, trying to understand your own population and your own institutions, where the weaknesses are between the institutions and where the weaknesses and grievances are in your own population. So your own population's complaints, if you like, against the government, against the conditions that they live in. Because that's where threat actors try to exploit weaknesses. Also connected to resilience is empowerment of people, empowerment of civilians. That means working with civil society, building out NGOs, journalism, media plurality, and media literacy, source criticism, those skills that enable your population to say, we don't want to read this trashy Russian propaganda. We know it's not high quality news. So it's empowering your citizens to resist. The second area of capabilities is around threat intelligence. And here we're talking about the capability to assess threats, particularly in sub-threshold areas, that is to say, in areas like cyber, hybrid, influence operations. And here it's about being able to quickly and efficiently understand the intent, the resources available to threat actors, the opportunities that they have, and to develop continuous monitoring and situational awareness that gives you early warnings. That should also include then a technical capability to attribute those actors if necessary, or at least to supply politicians with the technical data to be able to make an attribution. The third area is we can call deterrence. Now, obviously, deterrence has a history of being associated with the nuclear deterrence, but what we're increasingly seeing is these same principles being applied to sub-threshold activities, so particularly to hybrid threats. And here we're talking about a security policy capability within government that manages the continual bilateral dialogue with threat actors. Now, if Russia or China does something against you, or Iran does a cyber attack against you, you can signal back to them or not say anything. But either way, you're in dialogue with them. Doing nothing is also an answer. It means that you're accepting what they're doing. So when we're talking about deterrence, it means developing a mindset within your government's deterrence work that's based around raising the cost of threat activities against you and attempting to change the calculus of the threat actors to the extent that you can. It's easier for countries with lots of resources to do that. But in any case, at the very minimum level, some kind of government coordination around, for example, your Russia strategy or your China strategy, some kind of coordination over who gets to speak directly to these countries is absolutely essential. And this includes working closely with allies and developing a coherent response across the major partnerships that you have available to you. And then lastly, a cross-cutting capability is strategic communication, which has been touched upon by other speakers. And here there's two different ways of talking about strategic communication. Obviously, there's the military approach, which is about aligning your actions with your messaging. That's one form, that's relevant. And then there's also the more civilian approach to strategic communication, which is about using communication as a tool of management, a tool of managing your policies and for achieving the outcomes that you want to achieve. And here it seems that reputational security can be derived from being communicative as a government. That is to say, by having a continuous dialogue with your own population and attempting to build their resilience together with them, by having a continuous dialogue with your allies and your adversaries and attempting to shape expectations of your behavior and their behavior as a form of deterrence, and by continuously monitoring the information sphere. And that can build to, at least in theory, to a reputation that's based on reality, but where your entire work in this area is centered on these concepts of resilience and deterrence.
Thank you very much, James. I was particularly struck by your emphasis on engagement, maintaining, whether it's maintaining a dialogue even with threat actors, because to not talk to them or about them is a way of doing something and sends a message that over which you have no control. And I also like your reminder about communication as the way forward. Communicating, though, not just with your allies, but your enemies, and more importantly, with your own people on these issues. With that, I'd like now, in our short time remaining, to turn to the audience. Please ask short questions in view of the limited time that we have. And if you would, please direct it to the panelist you would like to respond to your question. Please.
Thank you very much. Wonderful presentations. Georgi Badridze, Rondeli Foundation. I'll try to make it really short. My idea of a question is to actually turn the tables and ask what you could recommend for us to do vis-a-vis the experts on us. Because this reputation is not just one-way street. It is also how people view us from the other side, what they know about us. And in my experience, and I want to echo Olena's ideas on this, many experts on Ukraine, on Georgia, others, are actually the people who had learned about us from the Russian sources. And what the Russian sources are, she explained perfectly, since the 18th century at least. What could we do to, without angering and annoying those people who actually, upon whose opinion decision making in the West very often depends, to somehow encourage them to learn about us from more reliable sources?
Great question. And what I'm going to do with this one is turn it to the in a sense, the least interested party on this podium, James, to give us the first response. And if there are responses from the rest of you, please join in.
Okay, thank you. I wouldn't say I'm the least interested.
Well, you know what I mean.
I have the least at stake.
Least
maybe.
at stake.
Yeah.
There we go. Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, on the one hand, it's worth remembering that you have a tremendous knowledge of Russia, and the knowledge that Georgians have of Russia is an asset. If you compare to the knowledge that Sweden or many European countries have of Russia, you know, we barely have enough Russia analysts, or let alone China analysts, to really do the work that would need to be done to understand those cultures. So you have one advantage, which is that you know the Russians very, very well, I think. But the main piece of advice I would give, and I'll leave plenty of room for the others, is that those capabilities that I listed, you can start working on any of them tomorrow. So, for example, a threat intelligence capability, so continuous monitoring of situational awareness of the information environment, you can start on that tomorrow. You can start building those tools. You can start to build interagency collaboration around that. I think some of these steps might take decades to build out, particularly societal resilience and working with NGOs and so on. Others can go very quickly. So doing those steps that you can do tomorrow, I think, is the first step.
Thank you. I think Nick also wanted to jump in on this. Am I right?
No, I agree. I agree. With all of this, the first step is to listen. And it's so important that you understand how you are seen in the world. Even if you disagree with how you're seen, you have to know how you're seen before you can move forward with anything. Otherwise, you'll be talking about you'll be talking about things that people don't know about, or missing, misdirecting your communication.
Thank you. I think, did you have anything to add? No?
Just to reinforce the point, we probably know very little how Georgia is perceived around the world. I mean, I've seen very few studies to that effect, not even coverage of Georgia in the foreign media. So I think the listening part is very especially important, because otherwise it's impossible to, other than generic messages that fits our own idea of ourselves, you cannot actually target vulnerabilities without knowing about them.
Thank you.
Yes, just a short remark. It's actually a question was not to me or to us, yeah, but from what I see, we have to start from school books, from very simple thing, because from my own experience, we can talk to academics, we can talk to experts, we cannot talk to politicians. But today in the Western schools, grow up generations of children who learn from their textbooks on history and geography that Ukraine and Georgia are part of Russian world. This is literally in there right now today. So then these people go to the universities and learn they are almost the same. And then we have to talk again to them to convince them that their knowledge is not correct. So let's start with simple. In Ukraine, as I know, Ukrainian Institute already started such projects. So I think that Georgia also can talk to partners in this way.
So to tell us about that project.
Just a quick remark then from me. We studied indeed textbooks and school books and school textbooks in 5 European countries. and tracked how Ukraine was, and important milestones of Ukrainian history were portrayed and described in those textbooks, and found out exactly that the Ukrainian narrative, in the way we would like to present it today and shape it today, is largely absent, and Ukraine is indeed portrayed not as a full-fledged agent of international relations of the 20th century or before or after. And that sort of showed a fundamental problem of knowledge production in today's world, in academia, in think tanks, in those where these textbooks actually originated from. And I don't believe that, you know, those academic centers or think tanks must be dominated only by international experts on Georgia, on Ukraine, on other countries. But I think it has to be Georgians and Ukrainians and people from other countries being embedded into those centers of knowledge production. That is crucial, because otherwise our stories will be told not by us, but by someone else. And I don't think that anyone who is not embedded in this reality, who doesn't feel it with their skin and bone, can grasp and speak about all the nuances of what's going on in our respective countries. And that, only that, will then inform more accurate and coherent perceptions and ultimately reputation for our countries internationally.
I couldn't agree more that if you don't tell your own story, somebody will most certainly tell it for you. Surely we have another question. Tamar?
Tamar Gizurashvili, Media Development Foundation. I have two questions. First, Professor Cull, about the perception, reputational security in Global South. For Ukraine, it's problematic. But since it's a matter of perception, how we judge, how they perceive this reputation in different world rather than West. And second question is to James. You mentioned how to build resilience in society. Do you have any recipe how to act when we have differences in approach between state and non-state actors? Because for our government, democratic institutions are threats rather than Russia. And there any criticism coming from West perceived as interference in sovereign democracy. Do you have any recipe how to build resilience in our society? Thank you.
Great. Nick, do you want to?
Certainly. I mean, I want to, I hope it isn't too much of a tangent, but I think part of the problem with reputation or with public opinion reaction is that publics don't necessarily react to events by reading everything they can, studying for a long time, and then coming to a conclusion. Publics react by using or reacting almost instinctively based on archetypes. And the two big drivers of public reaction, I think, when a crisis happens, is which side is stronger, and publics tend to favor the weaker side, and which side is most similar to me. So the response in the West to Ukraine was helped not only by reputational realities coming out of Ukraine and explanations, but also these archetypal drivers, that Ukraine was seen as being more similar to the West than Russia and was seen as being the weaker party. Now, in the Global South, those same drivers are reversed. Ukraine is portrayed as being different, and Russia establishes itself as being familiar, part of a positive narrative of anti-imperialism, and also Russia represents itself as the victim. It says, you know, the David and Goliath, if you like. Russia presents itself as being the David fighting against NATO, with Ukraine as a creature of this overwhelming Western threat. Which is a distortion, but that doesn't mean people aren't going to react emotionally to it. And so I think we can see how these same archetypes are playing out in the Israel-Palestine situation, with sides choosing who's similar to me, who's weaker, who's stronger. And communication battles actually taking place around an attempt to portray oneself as more similar and the weaker party in the struggle. I think Ukraine took it was taking a risk that it hadn't got resources for a global communication campaign, and it decided it should have a intense campaign in Western Europe between 2014 and 2022, and it didn't even have embassies in many places in the global south. So there was no attempt to have a culture or a narrative campaign in those places. That has now been reversed, and there's a lot of hard work going on right now to communicate globally. Does that help answer the question?
She's nodding yes, so
Good,
I think so.
I'm sorry, Vivian, to introduce a new thing just as you're.
Well, while we're waiting for Professor Cull to come to the new thing, James, maybe you want to.
No, that was it.
Oh, that was it?
The new thing was this idea of archetypes.
You froze,
and,
so I thought we lost you. No,
sorry.
It was brilliant. Thank you so much. James, resilience.
Okay. I can't answer this question. It's the hardest question you could have possibly asked, but thank you for that. I will say that from experience working in different countries, I think one of the things that really helps is distinguishing between disinformation as something that individuals do when they're wrong. So, you know, someone accidentally saying something wrong or just believing something that's wrong as an individual, which is entirely legal, and, you know, you have the right to be wrong in democracies, from the foreign interference side of it, where disinformation is used as a tool alongside espionage, cyber attacks, etc., etc. And distinguishing those also then distinguishes out what your role is as a societal actor in this. So you're perhaps much less of a threat to some political parties if you're purely working on foreign interference and not looking at domestic disinformation, for example.
Thank you so much. Is there a question here? Yes, please.
Just a small point, but I'm a little troubled about the semantics of this because I think there's a dimension that isn't quite fully explored. Reputation has to do with your sense of how approving you are of the behavior against a certain set of norms, but it doesn't really capture the underlying idea we've talked about of the perception and the knowledge on which perception is based, and correcting historical narratives. So you could admire Ukraine enormously and think they're plucky and they're doing all these things, and still not see them in terms of their own independent history, etc. And so it's just maybe a problem of the English language that reputation doesn't entirely include that whole dimension of perception. And I think it's important to understand that unless we understand, we put people on the context of the truth of their own history and reality, then we cannot really, how we judge what others do to them and what they're entitled to be in the world will be very much distorted. So I don't know what you think about that, but I'm just a little troubled by the semantics of our discussion, although the ideas are excellent and important.
Well, so I think you've highlighted a very important question, and that is the relationship between this reputation and archetype and actual perception. Could I invite at least one or two of our panelists to take that on? I know it's a knotty problem, but I think it needs to be addressed. James says no. Nick, are you going to try? No? All right. Volodymir, thank you.
Well, I think, again, the semantics of, you're right about the semantics of these definitions. In my opinion, reputation is a more longer-term, longitudinal concept compared to perception. Perception can be, very short-term. It can be easily changed. Whereas reputation is something that a country builds in a longer term. And actually, reputation also depends on how true that country stays to its declarations and to what it claims it is. And if there is a discrepancy, there can be no sustainable reputation that country or that place.
You can have a huge approval for the people and their character, etc., and still not be persuaded that they're entitled to be a sovereign nation. That's a whole different set of characteristics, and that's your perception of their history and where they stand in the world is separate from the reputation of being lovable and wonderful and talented and, you know, all sorts of great things. So they can have a great reputation, people want to help them. But at the end of the day, if they don't think they're entitled to that sovereignty, it'll evoke a different set of responses to a crisis.
That is something that we have been observing in the global south. I mean, I hate the term, but we're using it anyway. There is a strong sentiment for Ukraine on a people-to-people level in many of those countries and societies. There is sympathy, there is genuine interest. However, that doesn't change the longitudinal perception of the country as belonging to the Russian world, or being kind of closely affiliated with Russia, or being not too different from Russia. So I think those tracks can ironically coexist and paradoxically coexist in mental maps of so many people, and that's, I think, another dimension to the challenge that we're discussing today.
And I think with that, I will need to bring this panel to a close. I promised you at the beginning, I believe, something different. I hope you can agree with me that our 5 distinguished panelists did bring to us a really fresh way of thinking about some critical issues. And if we remember nothing else, I think from this panel, it will be, I hope, being true to one's identity and projecting the story of one's identity as clearly as possible. At the same time, acknowledging the vulnerabilities and the deficiencies and the challenges within that identity. And then finally, educating others in how to understand your identity, your reputation. So please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists for a wonderful panel. Thank you all.
Interesting panel, and I ask you to be back just 4:45 sharp. We start. Yes, we start the panel.